You might notice that we don't reveal any of our names. This is intentional, as we want all of your focus to be on the guest.
Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to Inquiry, the Philosophy Society's podcast. This is, I believe, our fourth installment, and today we have Dr. Steve Miller with us. He is an economics professor / chair.
The director of the
The
Johnson
director
Center.
of the Johnson Center at Troy University. Welcome, Professor Miller. This is where you say hi.
Hi,
Yes.
thank you. Glad to be here.
So, have you listened to one of our episodes before?
No, I have not.
Okay, so essentially, the ideal idea is that all of us get together, we call someone, and then we explore them, their academic interests, their lives, how that relates to their academic interests, etc. Right? Which is why we call it inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
An inquiry, very self-evident name, Captain Obvious. But so imagine that you're just hanging with us,
Right.
having a beer or whatever,
I
even
can do
if we
that.
haven't given you anything.
You have not.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
I can pretend.
Yeah, we're low on funds.
They won't let
We-
us have beer in the studio, so
We're also really low on funds, but we're a fledgling society for now. Hopefully that changes. Anyway, welcome, Professor Miller.
Thank you.
Let's start with an easy question. Why economics?
Why economics? So I was not always interested in economics. I initially went to college on the GI Bill. I'd been in the military for a few years, and I think I was going to major in international studies. I had been a linguist, actually, in the Army, and so I wanted to study foreign language and find a way to integrate that with social science and public affairs. So I was an international studies major, and what happened was I took a couple of economics classes, and after the second or third one, I had this kind of realization that more than political science or history or geography, which were the other subjects I was very interested in, economics had this just incredible explanatory power and this incredible way of looking at things that could help me make sense of the world around me. And so I just took more and more economics classes, and it made sense to continue studying and reading and writing about economics.
That's a very varied interest pool. Why geography? Like, what attracted you to geography?
So geography was always fascinating to me. I've always liked, just maps and studying different areas and thinking about different parts of the world and different cultures and how just the wide diversity that we see on planet Earth among societies. And it's physical geography, it's human geography, and it's economic geography. And as I studied kind of each of those aspects, physical, economic, and social geography, I realized that what I really cared about is, why some societies seem to prosper and why others don't, and that economics was arguably the most critical tool for understanding what was going on. The physical geography actually didn't explain much. For example, Hong Kong is built on a rock. There's not a lot of natural resources there, yet it's a society that rapidly became very prosperous. And also, I would argue, there's a high degree of social functionality there, right? And there are other places that are very rich in terms of natural resources that somehow fail to prosper. For example, they have oil or they have diamonds or wherever, whether we're talking about places in South America or sub-Saharan Africa or whatever. That didn't explain what I wanted to explain. So what I came to care about were social and economic geography. That culture seems to matter, but also it's that integration between culture and the economic institutions.
What do you want to explain, though?
What do I want to explain? So it's as P.J.
There a big
O'Rourke.
picture?
Right. Well, so there's a comedian or comic writer named P.J. O'Rourke, and he wrote a book once called, I don't even remember what the name of the book was, but it was a twist on Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, but it was his own silly version of it. And he said, the goal of economics, the reason the science of economics came to be, is because we wanted to know why some countries are rich and others just plain suck. So that is, I think, in large part the question I would like to answer through my own study of economics. Now, of course, when you get in to the field and you become an economist or you become a sociologist or anything else, a political scientist, you then have to pick a subfield and you have to focus your research more narrowly. You have to answer little bits of a question so that hopefully overall you can contribute to the overall knowledge. So that's the idea. So what do? I guess most of what I focus on is either labor economics, understanding labor markets in particular, and different aspects of labor markets, especially wage determination, what goes into determining people's wages. And then the other key thing I look at is people's economic beliefs. So I've done a lot of public opinion research.
In the question before, you spoke about economic geography and how even some countries with great amounts of resources, particularly those in South America, et cetera, how they still fail. Based on that, what are your thoughts on the current situation and the social upheaval in Venezuela?
I think that's a great example. So Venezuela obviously is a very oil-rich country, and they came to prosper over the past few decades because of the discovery of oil there, and especially at a time when oil prices were rising through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. What's happened there is the economic institutions went, what I would say is in terms of human progress, the wrong way. They went away from private property, but more importantly than that, they went away from anything that allows rational economic calculation. They went away from a functioning price system. And without a functioning price system, economic calculation becomes dysfunctional. And when you have dysfunctional economic calculation, you have a misallocation of resources. And before you know it, you have lines for bread, you have lines for toilet paper, you have lines for all of the things that people actually need to consume to continue to survive. And things become rationed artificially rather than by prices. They be rationed by other means. And that's exactly what you are still seeing in Venezuela, and it seems to just get worse and worse, because now every time someone tries to enter prices into the system, they're thrown in prison or they're accused of being greedy profiteers, and things become even more tightly rationed.
Thank you.
So I know we talked about what got you interested into economics, but again, based on what you research and all of your larger vaster interests and your personality in itself, I'm sure there was something that drove you to do what you do, as in your specific research in general, and what in itself has been your motivation to get into what you are right now.
That's trickier than you think. It's not clear that there was something in particular I was interested in. I will say that being in the military and being in the Army, it made me a little disillusioned with central planning and central decision making. I realized how that is not the most efficient way to do things in every situation. Sometimes it is, very much. For example, take that hill. That's often a very appropriately a centrally planned decision. So decisions in war often are. But, the military is large enough, the U.S. military is large enough, and many organizations are large enough. This university is large enough. If you try to centrally direct everything, including, the allocation of very basic things, paper clips, right? Desks, computers. If you try to centrally plan the distribution of those things that people need to get their jobs done, to be productive, it's often very counterproductive. There's often a lot of inefficiency that creeps in. And so seeing that maybe is what made me primed to, study the price system, study supply and demand, and say, aha, have a moment of aha. Oh, I'm starting to understand how markets work. Eventually, I think it was the third economics class I took, third or fourth economics class, where we read about the socialist calculation debate. So we read Oscar Lange. We even read, some Marx early on in that course, and then we read Mises and Hayek and their responses. And there was a debate among Maurice Daub, like I said, Oscar Lange, the Polish economist. There was a debate among socialist economists and classical economists at the time. It turns out they were also Austrian economists, but really they were just making classical economics arguments about whether or not economic calculation would be possible under a socialist system. That is, if the state actually owned the means of production, especially in the commanding heights of the economy, the large-scale natural resources, the railroads, things like that. And reading that made me realize that the critique of central planning, the idea, the question of where knowledge comes from, that was very interesting to me. And it made me realize what was going on. It's not possible for someone at the top of an organization. It's not even possible for a group of managers sitting together in a conference room to have enough of the local, particular, specific knowledge that people out on the ground doing their jobs have. And it's not possible for them to be able to have enough of that knowledge to be able to make decisions for those people. And this doesn't mean that all management needs to be totally decentralized in every organization, but it does mean that the larger and more complex a society is, or the larger, more complex even a firm is, the more you do need to think about how can you decentralize decision making so that you can take advantage of the particular local and specific knowledge that individuals have. Often the person working on the factory floor on a particular task is the one who knows the most about that task and knows best how to deal with problems with that task. It doesn't mean they don't need a boss. It doesn't mean they can't or shouldn't be supervised. But it does mean you need to be humble enough as a supervisor or as an owner, right? Or as a governor. You need to be humble enough to understand that they have knowledge that you don't have and to be able to move some of the decision-making power down.
Along that lines, because we talked a lot about Steve Miller, the economist and the researcher. We haven't talked about Steve Miller, the professor. And so how do you connect yourself as an economist and a researcher into passing that information on to the next generation of economic students? And what brought that aspect of you? And do you find a difference in researching economics, being an informed economist versus dealing with new students who are just new to this field?
Yeah. So if I were to think about kind of the flow, which way things flow for me, I definitely it's the teaching and what I actually learn from teaching in the classroom and what I see students respond to and what they have trouble understanding and what they find intuitive. That actually has informed a lot of my research, especially when I'm trying to understand people's beliefs about economics, but also when I'm trying to understand just how people interact with a market system in general. That's where I've learned the most. I started off early as a student tutoring. I tutored for the athletic department at the university where I was an undergraduate. It's Towson University in Maryland. I tutored for the athletic department, and then I ended up also tutoring for the tutoring center. So I was kind of tutoring all the time at one point there in micro and macroeconomics, and then even in the upper level intermediate micro and intermediate macro classes. And what happened there is I learned a lot about what it is that most students struggle with in terms of understanding economics, what it is they struggle with and what they actually find fairly obviously intuitive. And I did notice that for a lot of professors, if you're just going straight out of the textbook or if you're just following it the way it makes sense to you, that you may go very quickly over something that students actually struggle with and you probably would do better for them to spend a lot of time on. And you end up spending a lot of time on something that actually generally most students would find pretty intuitive and get pretty easily. And so just kind of seeing how students struggle with some material and find other kinds of material intuitive really helped inform me not just how to be a professor later, but then in my research, what are the economic questions that I want to ask as a researcher that I need to kind of spend more time explaining.
You listed out several epiphanies that you got along the way. Do you think it has...
Well, these weren't like flashes of lightning on the road.
How would you describe them then?
There were probably many moments that collectively over the course of a few semesters led to me saying, wow, this economic way of thinking explains more, sheds more light than I would have ever thought. I thought it was going to be a boring businessy class where we talked about prices and profit.
But do you think any of that affects how you view the world in terms of your interpersonal relationships? Do you think that has changed at all, or do you just think it's completely different? As in terms of if I study physics, that's not going to change how I interact with the world around me, for the most part, right? I could do theoretical physics and still treat my mom the same way. Do you think that the divide is just as deep?
That is a fascinating question. That is a fascinating question. I can kind of tell a little bit of a story in response to that.
Yeah.
So at one time, I thought to myself, well, what I know about economics and what I'm learning about how markets work and what I'm learning about information and incentives and the interplay between them in markets, I can apply that in my life. And I actually tried to devise a scheme to make household chores between my wife and myself. At the time, we had no kids. And some of you know that now I have a bunch. I tried to devise a scheme that, would make everything incentive compatible so that there would no longer be these frictions or questions of whose job it was to do what when, and have something like a really organized system, but they actually took advantage kind of market incentives and the opportunity cost of people's time and all of that. And it was a miserable failure. What then? Well, I've learned a lot since. And an important piece of understanding economics actually comes from a political scientist named Elinor Ostrom, who did win the Nobel Prize in economics. So her work is not at all unrelated to economics, but she's a fascinating researcher, and it was a variety of research methods, and a lot of it was, they call it field research, but I mean, she would literally go out to very distant parts of the world and study small homogeneous groups, small tribes all over the world, and how they would deal with commons problems and some forms of economic and social organization. And then she would go to more heterogeneous groups, and she would look around. And so there's some basic insights that fall out of not just her research, but that entire Bloomington School research program in political theory. And one key thing is, for small homogeneous groups with a lot of patience, or as economists would like to say, with low time preference, right? It's very easy to engage in social organization and have not only peace and harmony, but efficient outcomes without dealing with what we think of as like market mechanisms, right? It's when you get into more large heterogeneous groups, especially large heterogeneous groups where people have very high time preference, where many people are very, very impatient, that prices and incentives become very important. So within a typical household, trying to do everything by the market doesn't make a lot of sense. It's arguably less efficient, right? But if you're talking about a society with a few thousand people, it starts to make more sense. So someone who was inspired by Elinor Ostrom is David Scarbeck at King's College London, and he's studied American prisons. And what he discovered is once prisons get to have a few thousand inmates or so, they need a form of governance and a form of market interaction that just kind of takes over. And the rules of the actual prison, the written rules, go by the wayside. Things are run by prison gangs within the prisons who are the primary enforcement mechanism, but also they have a flourishing, although not necessarily a clean, but a flourishing market system. And why? Well, it's because prisons drifted, especially in a place like California, but across the U.S. this is true. Prisons drifted from being small homogeneous groups where people were there, with the same people for a long time, and so they could actually afford to have, long-term preferences and think more about the future, to much larger or more diverse groups. And a lot of whom, and it makes sense that, with a large group of criminals, many of them would have what we say is high time preference, right? Impatience. They want their rewards, or they want punishment, or they want vengeance, whatever it is they want it now. And that's what leads to a need both for market mechanisms, but also some very severe and enforceable ways of making contracts and agreements binding.
Along those lines, I'm curious to know how you view the market then.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the market is an emergent phenomenon that occurs at, some arbitrary number, right? At some arbitrary number of people, and then at that amount, the market emerges? Or do you think it has to do with simply what people's attitudes are? If it's the latter, right, then one could make the case that we can try to change our attitudes and just treat everybody as family and hey, to hell with market economics, right? But if that's not the case, and there's fundamentally something different when 100 people converge in that, even if they all have the same attitudes towards each other, just by the congregation of so many people, a market emerges ipso facto. Like 100 molecules make whatever, right?
Right.
An atom, and 100 atoms make a molecule, whatever, right? If there were 99 of those atoms, despite the atoms being ontologically similar, the emergent molecule wouldn't form, right? So do you think, how do you view the market? Do you think this is a apt description of that one?
I think the way to view it is an emergent phenomenon.
Right.
And is there a magic number? No, there's not a magic number, because keep in mind there are multiple variables that go into place. It's not just the size of the group, it's how homogeneous or heterogeneous it is. In other words, how diverse or similar the people within that group are. And then on top of that, it has to do with the preferences of people within that group and whether they're focused more on long-term or short-term goals, and not just collectively, but individually within the group. How much diversity is there in terms of people's time preference? And that ends up mattering a whole lot. So it's all of those things going in together. And then there is, I agree with Adam Smith, there is just a natural human propensity to truck barter and exchange. So markets are definitely an emergent phenomenon. And every time there's been an attempt to prevent markets from emerging because there was a strong preference for central planning, that's been a pretty spectacular failure. And not only has it been a failure, I mean a failure in positive terms, and just in terms of the positive analysis, right, which is the markets emerge anyway. There are markets for drugs and cell phones and everything else that's banned in prisons, right? There were cigarettes in the Gulag, even if they had been banned. And not only were there cigarettes, but they were used as money. And there were all kinds of goods that existed in we're talking about a very totalitarian regime, right? There are goods that exist within North Korea, possibly the most totalitarian regime in existence today. There are goods that exist within North Korea and markets for those goods that are not formally allowed in any way. And there's a lot of effort being made to suppress those markets. I mean, with, pretty severe consequences for being found in violation of the rules. So that's what I would say. It's not just that it's an emergent phenomenon. It's an inevitable emergent order market interaction is. But what you find is there's not a lot of market interaction in between my children. There's a little bit, right? There's a little bit of trading. There may be occasionally times where they actually use a currency, right, to buy things from each other. But because it's a small, relatively homogeneous group with relatively low time preference, there's also just a lot of sharing and a lot of common use of resources. And so I think G.A. Cohen's example of a camping trip, for example, right? I mean, that's a great example how a small homogeneous group can kind of get along and make something like socialist sharing of resources very viable. But as soon as the group becomes either larger or more heterogeneous, or people start being a little more focused on the short term, that's when it gets shaky. And if all three of those things happen at the same time, which is pretty much any society we know of right now, things change. But that was what was really cool about Elinor Ostrom's research, is that she was able to still find small societies where, yes, they were able to solve a lot of problems without markets or without the kind of property rights that we think of as being vital to social order. Is you don't always need those if the group is small enough, homogeneous enough, and very future focused, kind of everybody on the same page and thinking about the long term.
The question about small, homogeneous groups and how it's played in your family dynamic. And I'm just curious as the director of the Johnson Center, you've been able to work with a bunch of like-minded professors, or maybe not like-minded, I'm not sure. All economists serving the same function. Is it a little chaotic there, or do you all agree?
It's only a small homogeneous group from the outside. That you would have to be pretty far outside of it to look at that group of faculty and researchers and say that it's a small homogeneous group. And I don't want to call them factions because it's not like people are stabbing each other in the middle of the night, right? It's not, in other words, it's right. It's not like San Quentin prison, right? Not at all. There's only 9 or 10 people. But there are factions. So there are research factions. There are intellectual factions. There are people who believe that empirical research is real research. There are people who believe that theoretical research is real research. There are people who believe the big important questions of economics are related to macroeconomic questions and macroeconomic phenomena. And then there are researchers within the group who believe that macroeconomics isn't even really economics, and macroeconomics is almost an oxymoron. Right? Because all economics is microeconomics. It's founded in an understanding of price theory. Right? So there are all these different things. And then there are different affiliations. There's people who are more fans of public choice approaches and Virginia school approaches to economics. There are people who are coming from more of an Austrian perspective. There are people who are coming from more of a Chicago school traditional price theory perspective. It's far more diverse than I think because on the outside, a lot of people would look at it and they'd say, well, it's this one center with this one, very clearly stated free market mission, and it's for the moment it's all in economics and finance. Although we are looking to explain because we're all interested in interdisciplinary research. I think all of us at one time or another in our careers have actually done work with other social scientists or with people studying the law, et cetera. So it's a surprisingly diverse group. And so what does that mean? It means, yeah, there's little frictions here and there, but not nasty ones, but we have, for example, I just left our research seminar. We have a research seminar almost every Friday, and the Q&A period of the research seminar. So someone goes up and presents a paper. Sometimes we bring someone in from Auburn or Ole Miss or somewhere, nearby, but a lot of times it's one of our faculty or our graduate students presenting. And when they present, they go for about 45 minutes, and then there's a good 45 minutes of question and answer. And that question and answer, to an outsider, would look like a very brutal intellectual beating from the audience, because that's what it is. It becomes, how can I find something that's wrong with your paper, with your research, and how do I beat you over the head with it until you submit, and by the way, cite one of my papers at the end of the process. And I'm being a little silly and I'm exaggerating it, right? But that's the reason it's done that way. There's a good argument for why things will be done that way. We all become better researchers as a result of that, right? Unless you face harsh criticism, you're not going to have as much incentive to improve what you're doing. But yeah, it is funny, because I have a sense that, if you were in another department on this campus, right, or if you were just an outsider from another university looking at us in the Johnson Center, you would say, well, it's all a bunch of people on the same page, and is that really healthy? And you would have no idea. There's an endless scope for disagreement among academics, any academics, but probably especially among social scientists.
Yes, as a professor and an administrator, you're around a lot of different people and different students in the college experience, and like seeing this and seeing how students interact and like how they learn and things like that. What would you say is your biggest fear and your greatest hope of future generations from what you see now?
Should I start with the fear or the hope?
Your choice.
So the fear, and I don't see it. I don't see it much at Troy University, but we're seeing it on other campuses, and I've seen it at other campuses I've either spoken at or taught at. That there is an effort to actually just shut down opposing points of view. So the opposite of the seminar approach, right? Where the whole point is you invite someone there to present their ideas, and then you criticize, right? And then they respond to your criticisms. And the end result of that, hopefully, is not only does the person presenting have a better product that they publish, but maybe you also, that inspires you to have an idea and come up with a research topic, and that promotes you to do more research and think more deeply about an issue. So that's probably the hope side, by the way, is that students engaged in that process, whether it's through a seminar or a reading group, or even in their basic classes, but then there's a research project and maybe they present it at the undergraduate research showcase. My hope is that it becomes all about open engagement, scholarly discourse, and that students really come to value not just their own ideas, but the ideas of others, and that their response to ideas they don't like is criticism and deeper thought about the issue, and then invite response. My fear is that they catch on to the trend that we see at some American universities of shut it down, where you're snapping your fingers or yelling until someone has to walk off the stage, or in the extreme cases that we've seen in a couple of instances where they actually are, physically assaulting the not just the people speaking, but the professors who hosted the talk, or the administrators who are trying to escort them onto or off of campus. That's very concerning, right? Because probably any of us want, in terms of all the faculty at this university, and most of the faculty at most universities, all we really want is we want a forum for ideas to be discussed. And my life would be much poorer if people couldn't tell me I was wrong, and obviously my life would be much poorer if I couldn't tell others they were wrong.
As an outsider looking at economics, right, or any subject for that matter, there's two sorts of motivations to any academic discipline, right? One is to believe that things can be reduced to some statements, right?
Mhm.
And then trying to figure out what those statements are. And the other approach is to just find unique, interesting correlation and interesting causations, and not attempting to, functionally reduce to, say, I don't know, 5 axioms, right? So that would be, the difference between a physicist's approach to science and a biologist's approach to science, right? So biology can only go so deep, right? And then it becomes physics. So what would interest you the most then?
I
do
mean,
you-
definitely the latter.
What was the latter? I don't remember what.
Or not the latter, the former. Definitely the former. The former is, what are the handful of axiomatic truths what are the axioms we can find? That's the interesting question. And then, yes, empirical retesting and retesting and retesting of those axioms.
But as an
And-
outsider, I'd rather read free economics than, I don't know,
Uh-huh.
a page that contains 4 axioms, 4 noble truths of how humans function.
So-
right. So at least the other seems diverse and prettier. What would you say?
So the reaction to Freakonomics was interesting. So, right, for the audience, Freakonomics was a book where Steve Levitt, an economist at the University of Chicago, got together with a journalist named Stephen Dubner. And Dubner had this knack for saying, wait a minute, this stuff that Levitt and his zillions of graduate students who actually, collect the data, this is really fascinating stuff, but they don't know how to promote it to a wider audience. I'm going to talk to him a lot and figure out what's interesting and cool and promote it, find a broader audience for it because it's really interesting. And so there was a reaction among economists to this book, which was, for many economists, they viewed it as just a random collection of empirical discovery, right? It's just you run regressions and see what sticks, right? You just look at mounds and mounds of data and see what patterns you can find within the data themselves. And the other reaction economists had was, no, there's actually still pieces of the economic way of thinking in here. It's just that they're not made explicit as the explanation, but there is economics there. So there's a couple interesting things going on in Freakonomics. One was the chapter on realtors. So there's an argument there that realtors have an incentive to try and sell your house quickly and cheaply, not necessarily at the highest price for the homeowner. And the logic is pretty straightforward. And I would say the logic is economic logic, right? I mean, yes, they go and they look at data and they figure this out, and they do. They show with the data that it seems pretty clear that realtors are not trying to get the maximum price for the house. But they have an explanation built into that, and it's an economic explanation, which is, I guess I'll walk through the logic, right? So for a realtor, you can make 6% of $200,000 or make, right? But maybe it would take 6 months to sell that house. Or you can make 6% of $180,000 and sell the house in a week, right? And for realtors, time is money, right? If they can sell more houses, but at a lower average price, if you look at the end of the year, most of them are on average are going to make higher commissions. And so their incentives are very clear. Sell the house, get the house sold, and push the owner to drop the price more rapidly than maybe is beneficial to the owner. Right? Maybe it would make more sense for the owner in terms of their own profit, because that $20,000 is a big deal to the owner. But for the realtor, it's not $20,000 that they're dropping the price, it's 6% of $20,000. Or if they're the seller's agent and they're making half the commission, it's actually 3% of $20,000, right? So yes, they face different incentives. Well, that's an economic argument. And that requires the economic way of thinking to even begin to understand that realtors and the people they represent have different incentives. It actually has a name in economic theory, the principal agent problem. The principal is the realtor who is acting on behalf of the agent who's the homeowner.
So, this is an example of things that people wouldn't think that economics can, explain, but just various things that it can. What are some limitations to the economic way of thinking that you've faced?
I think one big limitation is those small homogeneous groups where people are engaged in a very long and very set of long-term goals. All right. So economics has, frankly, by now attempted to explain all kinds of things. It's been used to explain suicide, a rational choice approach to suicide. Actually, I have a couple of colleagues who are working on a paper on that. It's been used to explain marriage and the choice of marriage mates, and to some extent, economics. Actually, the economic way of thinking can explain all of these things. But what it can't do, and this is what I hinted at earlier, is it probably can't tell you definitively at this moment what to do in a particular situation. It can't always tell you within a particular situation, because the fact of the matter is we are good at calculating costs and benefits. We're good at kind of maximizing utility when we have a lot of experience with a transaction, when we have a lot of experience doing something. So for example, if you buy groceries every week and you're pretty much buying the same kinds of things every week, you get a lot of practice with that, and you're very, very good after a while at reducing the waste involved. And not just reducing the waste, but actually kind of maximizing what you're getting for your dollar. Consumers are very good at that. And that's because that's an interaction that they're engaged in time after time after time after time. Big decisions like who to marry, you make once, or even for the weirdest of my friends, 6 times in your life, right? You're only going to make that relatively infrequently. So with large, infrequent decisions, very major infrequent decisions, it's not that the economic way of thinking falls apart, but it's very, very difficult on the knowledge end for individuals to be able to in any way get close to the actual costs and benefits, and being able to weigh choices against each other.
So do you think everybody should be doing big data analysis all the time now?
No.
And just correlation studies from big data analysis?
No, not at all.
When I'm making personal life choices, figure out how many people have said yes to a particular situation, how many people have said no, what's that led to, etc.
No, that would be far inferior to actually thinking it through, and that has to do with the heterogeneity question, right? So the idea that individuals are very diverse and they're going to have very different preferences and very different characteristics. They're going to have very, very different goals, and decisions should be made based on what your goals are, not on what everyone else's goals are.
So going a little bit into like the two branches of economics in itself, macro and micro, we kind of like just playfully said that sometimes macroeconomics is considered to be an oxymoron. And so most people that I talk to about this, like, it seems to be that there is one obviously different basis on which both these sciences are built. And on top of that, there is a disconnect between researchers in these two fields. And as an economist, like when you go into this and you like, try to explain issues in the world based on both of these things, do you feel like there is more work needed in bridging that gap between macro and micro?
That is such a good question, and such an important question for the economics profession today, because I think that's absolutely the case. That for over 50 years, micro and macroeconomics had been drifting apart, and they were brought back together a little bit in that macroeconomists for a while cared about something called the micro foundations. In other words, there was a hint of an idea for a while in macroeconomics that good macroeconomic analysis relied on some observation of what was going on in the microeconomic world, right? That you couldn't talk about unemployment coherently, which is a very macroeconomic topic. Couldn't talk about unemployment coherently unless you had a really solid microeconomic understanding and analysis of labor markets, right? However, let me tell a story about a very silly kind of micro foundation, and this is something that still bothers me. And by the way, there are many, as macroeconomists, there are many macroeconomists, and maybe even some microeconomists, but there are many macroeconomists who still admire these studies and think they're good. So one important macroeconomic concept that came up a few decades ago was this idea of menu costs. There was this belief that menu costs are important, and there's something that actually can affect how efficient the macroeconomy is operating. Well, what are menu costs? Menu costs are the costs of changing or updating prices. So menu costs were used as an explanation to explain why sometimes prices are sticky. That is, why are prices sometimes inflexible? The ultimate sticky price from a Keynesian macro framework is sticky wages, right? So the idea is that a particular price, the price of labor, wages are sticky. They're not sticky upward, they're sticky downward. What that means is employers, for whatever reason, it seems like they would rather lay X number of people off, which contributes to unemployment. This is why it's related to understanding employment, right? They would rather lay people off, some people off, than cut everyone's wages. So when there's a contraction in the economy and a particular industry or the entire economy is shrinking, right? The notion is this leads to unemployment, and it leads to excess unemployment in a Keynesian framework because wages are sticky downward. So employers are actually going to hire less and lay people off rather than just lower everyone's wages in response to this real shock to the economy. That's the idea. And so to buttress this idea that prices or wages are sticky, one of the most cited studies on this looked at newsstand prices in New York City, and it looked at the prices of magazines especially, and how readily they changed in response to overall changes in prices elsewhere. And what they found was, magazine prices don't change as frequently as, looking at inflation or monetary aggregates or just overall GDP, right? That they don't adjust accordingly. The prices don't rise as quickly as they do for many other things, and they don't fall as quickly as they maybe do for other things. And so, macroeconomic conditions are changing, but these prices are sticky. And all I can do is look at that and say, okay, how are wages like magazines? Like, I'm not sure I understand the connection. I'm very sympathetic to this argument that, maybe there is something awkward about telling someone that they're getting a pay cut. I would say, though, there is also something awkward about telling someone that they don't have a job anymore. So I'm not sure that's a totally consistent explanation. But also just the idea that is a micro foundation for this macroeconomic view that price stickiness is a big, major macroeconomic factor, when we know that if it's the price of gasoline, for example, or what's funny, prices of an actual menu, say at McDonald's, right? That those change all the time, and they change very frequently in small increments. That the more volatile the price of something is, the more they make it so that the menu costs are easy to change. And so that's always struck me as an interesting disconnect. So all that is to say is that I think micro foundations have been underdone. There really needs to be thought in economics more. Macro and microeconomists possibly not just working together, but maybe being the same people, right? Of actually using solid microeconomics, especially price theory, which is the heart of microeconomics, to help you understand macroeconomic phenomena and not have a macroeconomic theory that's inconsistent with all of our understanding of individual markets.
So essentially, I know you're advised against applying market ideas and my ideologies to small homogeneous groups, but I take the punt anyway, right? So this is quite a small group that I've assembled here, right? And I've arbitrarily declared myself the leader. I don't even care if they don't view me that way. But for all intents and purposes, I've arbitrarily declared myself the leader. This is truth, right? This is not even a hypothetical scenario. So given this, right, and given that I like taking decisions for everybody else, even if it's bad, even if it will result in my downfall.
I think we all do.
Yeah.
Right.
Even if it will result in my downfall eventually. I probably won't be around in the university long enough, so I take the risk. Given all of that, what do you think should be the sweet spot? Do you think I should let a couple more people in, or we should stop at 5?
Well, you would need a bigger studio.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But if you want to talk about a philosophy society, it seems to me you'd want that to be a larger, more heterogeneous group.
Sure, but then that presents problems in and of itself, right? And then people won't listen to me anymore. There'll be random coalitions, which is annoying. So once again, what do you think is the sweet spot? Do you think there is a sweet spot? Not mathematically, but what's your opinion?
Yeah.
On a sweet spot number, given your experience of life and however old you are, 45, just throwing it out there.
I'm 43.
Okay.
So
close.
That's such a strange question.
It is, but
because you're saying don't put a number on it, but where's
No,
the
I am
sweet
saying
spot?
put a number on it.
Okay, what is
But it
the
can be a
sweet
range
spot?
essentially, like I don't know, 7
But
to
again,
9.
it's not just the number; it's how heterogeneous or homogeneous. So it could be hundreds of people if it's a relatively homogeneous group and everyone has very low time preference, right?
Right.
If everyone's very patient, the issue you would run into, and I think part of the reason you might run into factions is
It's because I'm
as a philosophy,
yes.
as a philosophy society grows, it's likely to become more heterogeneous, right?
Yeah.
So that would lead to factionalization. But there's another thing that's going on, and you hinted at it, which is if everyone is graduating in anywhere from 1 to 3 years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Then everyone, almost by definition, has somewhat high time preference for what they expect to get out of their participation in such a
Right.
society. And so that makes, are we talking about a sweet spot for you having control, or are we talking about a sweet spot
for me
for
having
it
control,
being
yes.
for being a thriving, functioning society?
No.
Oh.
That is
Okay, so the sweet spot for you for
inconsequential.
control would be to keep it as the size that it is, and I mean, you could maybe allow one more person, or
That's what I thought.
maybe kick someone out, somewhere in that range
Yeah.
of one fewer or one more.
the weakest link is going out now.
I think what you all would want to do is, if the goal was to oust him, I think what you all would want to do is you would want to bring on strategically, though, bring on allies who are homogeneous to the rest of you.
I mean, I guess we could go along what you said earlier about markets being emergent phenomena, and so ultimately, despite the totalitarian regime, we still have emergent phenomena just taking over here. So
That's
I
right.
guess that'll just work out. In any case, I guess so going down out from Stephen Miller, the economist and the director of the Mal Johnson Center, let's talk about you as Stephen Miller, the father, the husband, and
Okay.
Stephen Miller, the person. And so how would you describe yourself outside the realm of economics to people in general?
I would love to say that I'm normal, but I'm probably not. As a matter of fact, my colleagues, relatives, friends, they're always pointing out that I'm not normal. So I have diversions and hobbies like anyone else. But I'm a family man. I have 6 children. So I spend a lot of the week at, soccer and baseball and Cub Scouts, or just, picking people up, taking people to the doctor is like a major logistical thing in our household. I love baseball. I'm not just hanging out at Little League games, but professional baseball. I follow that pretty closely and love to pay attention to that. And then I've forever, or not forever, but for almost 30 years, I've been really into motorcycles. And every once in a while I get a newer one because it's going to be more reliable and actually be useful. And it makes me wistful for older, more broken ones. So I have a tendency to acquire older, broken motorcycles and mess with them and, ride a little and they break, and ride a little and they break. And there's just something, and by the way, nothing most people consider nice. Usually it's just older Japanese bikes from the 70s, 80s, or even early 90s now. But it's just, there's something peaceful for me about messing with something like that. It's very logical, right? If something is wrong, there is a reason why. There's a reason why it's not working. There's always a reason. There's always a very clear logic to it. Whereas if someone disagrees with you, it may or may not be logical. There may or may not be a way to actually resolve that. So that's what I like. When I have a conflict with a motorcycle, there's a reason why. When I have a conflict with another person, it may not be something that I can just deduce, not readily. So that's a little about me and what I do and what I'm interested in. My day is very full. I probably start answering email most days at 5:30 in the morning. Students love to email me overnight. Apparently they're awake at night and I wake up in the morning. And and my whole day is a mix of work and then putting out fires at home and putting out fires in the office, and metaphorically, sometimes really. And so I just, I don't know when the last time was that I, for example, felt lonely or bored. Those are emotions I remember feeling like decades ago, but it's been a long time since I've ever been remotely anything like bored or lonely. So I have a lot of sympathy for people who do feel that way, because I would imagine I'm very, very happy, and I imagine I would be a lot less happy if I were ever bored or lonely, but I don't get the chance. So I've somehow cut all of that out of my life.
I appreciate that subtle correction of course that you had for us there, reminding us that you're busy and that we're taking up a lot of your time, which we are. But one last parting question though before we end. Is there one idea that has affected you the most? / one idea that you'd probably want to relay to everybody?
I have to go with a very, very boring one.
It doesn't matter.
It's very boring to most people, but the law of demand. I mean, the idea that demand curves slope downward, that explains so much of the world. There are so many people who want to try and explain phenomena in the world without recognizing, pretty clearly that if the price of something goes up, people will tend to buy less of it. And if the price of something goes down, people will tend to buy more of it. And this relates to all kinds of costs. And it's not just necessarily the price in terms of dollars and cents, right? That if something becomes more costly to acquire or more costly to deal with, if you make a process more costly, people are going to disengage from it. They're going to be less likely to take on that burden as it becomes more costly. And if something becomes less costly or something becomes, for example, subsidized, people are going to take on more of it. They're going to consume more of it. So, a kind of a corollary to the law of demand, and this is a very informal corollary, but it's something economists say all the time, is if you tax something, you get less of it. If you subsidize it, you get more of it. And yet the world of public policy and the world of reasoning, even if you read, very intelligent writers and in famous newspapers like even the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, right? You'll see issues and policies discussed as though people are surprised that when something was taxed, people did less of it, and that when something was subsidized, they did more of it. And I just find that fascinating. So for example, if you subsidize insurance markets, people are going to buy more insurance, right? But also prices are going to go up because now you've put more people in the market. You've made it so more people can afford it. That increases demand. So it's very important to understand the interaction of demand and supply, but especially downward sloping demand. For whatever reason, that's one people love to deny. They want to pretend that if the price of something goes up, that won't affect how much people buy. And if the price of something goes down, that won't affect how much people buy. And it does. It does. We can debate over elasticity, but the elasticity is almost never zero, and it's almost never infinity.
Thanks for subsidizing your time with us
Yes.
then, because I can attest to the fact that because of this, hopefully all of us want to talk to you much more, but we're sort of out of time. That's inevitable. But hopefully, people listening to this back, wherever, in Troy, mostly, students, hopefully, get motivated to, get to know you / study economics / whatever else. Hopefully,
All of social science and the humanities. I would love it if, I gave that story. That's what I did. I explored. I took a lot of history classes. I took a lot of geography classes. I took a few political science classes along the way.
I mean, I'm a biology major, so, my biases are sort of elsewhere. But yeah, I can appreciate that.
Yeah.
There's only so much you can do.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Professor Miller, for your time. We hope you enjoyed
You're
your
welcome.
time here.
I did. It was a great discussion.
You might notice that we don't reveal any of our names. This is intentional, as we want all of your focus to be on the guest.